Powell, City Hall Bureau Chief with City and State. Joining me on today's City and State TV is Councilmember Mark Levine. He represents the Upper West Side of Manhattan, Morningside Heights, and West Harlem, as well as parts of Washington Heights. Thank you for joining us today, Mark.
Thank you, Nick. Great to be here.
So, Mark, you are also the chair of the Council's Committee on Parks,
Right.
and we had a big parks announcement the other day with Mayor de Blasio announcing $130 million to be distributed to 35 parks in low-income neighborhoods. Now, this was kind of a pivot from him a little bit because he originally endorsed having private groups redistribute a fifth of their budgets to some of these less funded parks. But you support this kind of revision of that plan using public money instead.
Well, the city's been underfunding parks for decades. We only put 0.5% of the city's budget into our park system. It's far less than we used to fund in decades past and less than most other big cities in America. And the shortfall is huge, hundreds of millions probably to meet all the unmet needs. And really the only way to cover that kind of gap is through the public sector. So the solution to the parks equity problem ultimately has to be of a scale that only the city can take care of. And that's why we were able to put $130 million in, more actually, because DEP is putting in $37 million for some green technology as well. And there's some operating money. So it's a big package, and it's going to have a real impact in the neighborhoods that need it most.
Now, the mayor left open the door a little bit, and the City Hall representatives also for private parks to still raise some money on behalf of these less funded parks. Is that something that you support, and that's something that's still in discussion?
Well, absolutely. The conservancies can and should do more to support small neighborhood parks well beyond their borders, and I think they're interested in doing that. And I think discussions are still ongoing. I'm hoping that soon there'll be news on that front. They have an important role to play, but really it's dwarfed by what we can do as a city. And we're able to fund major capital improvements and additional staffing on a permanent basis that the money and resources of the conservancies aren't going to be able to cover on a widespread basis. So what we did yesterday, what we announced, is really, I think, a big victory and the only way to start addressing the equity problem.
Now, I'm glad you brought up the equity problem because you've called the park system two-tiered in the past, and I know Mayor de Blasio has kind of echoed that sentiment. And the previous administration has taken some heat for supposedly kind of encouraging this approach. Veronica White, the previous parks commissioner, pushed back against that notion yesterday, noting that they poured in, I think she said $5 billion into parks capital over their tenure. So, I mean, do you think that the Bloomberg administration could have done more to kind of level the playing field, or I'm just curious where you stand on how they performed?
Look, they did wonderful things for particularly the larger destination parks in the city. They deserve a lot of credit for that. The High Line, Brooklyn Bridge Park, Governor's Island, and also for a number of the mid-sized parks that were covered under the mayor's NYC 2030 plan. But when it comes to the smaller neighborhood parks, 2 acres, 3 or 4 acres, that really wasn't their priority. And for the average New Yorker, that's really what affects their life most directly. That's where they're sending their kids to play after school. That's where they're going for picnics. That's where they can walk to. And unfortunately, there are hundreds of parks around the city, these small neighborhood parks that have gotten almost no investment. In fact, the Parks Department tallied it up, and there were over 200 parks that have gotten less than $250,000 in investment in the last 20 years, which is nothing, barely enough even to keep up with wear and tear, let alone modernization. And they had a really good rubric for narrowing that list down to 35 of the most needy in neighborhoods that have high density and a lot of low-income people and growth. And those are the 35 that we're targeting in this first round.
Now, I want to talk legislation a little bit. Now, Daniel Squadron, state senator from Brooklyn and Lower Manhattan, has a bill on the table that kind of also would encourage private conservancies to dedicate some of their funding towards smaller parks. Have you spoken with the senator since this announcement was made by Mayor de Blasio and where that legislation stands?
Well, we were together at the announcement yesterday, and he's still pushing forward on that plan. And I think he deserves credit for keeping attention on the equity issue. I'm not sure that the kind of tithing that he is proposing makes sense. I think there might be some legal challenges, and I'm worried about its impact on conservancies. But I think that he is right that conservancies can do more. They have tremendous expertise and the kind of complicated work that it takes to run a park, a busy park, a modern park in New York City. And they should be sharing that expertise and training others and otherwise spreading resources around. I believe they want to do that, and I'm hopeful and really expect that there'll be news on that front in the near future.
And you've talked about, actually in an op-ed you wrote in the Huffington Post, you called the parks budget stagnant. So yeah. I'm curious, are you satisfied with where the budget is now, even accounting for the changes that Mayor de Blasio made?
Well, if you have a little perspective here, we're still so far below where we were, say, in the 60s when we devoted 1.5% of the city's budget to parks. We had full-time staff, well over 6,000. And today, as I mentioned, we're down to a third of that relative to the total budget, at less than 0.5%, about 0.5%. And the head count in the department's about 4,000 and change of the full-time year-round staff. So anyway you look at it, we're down from our peak. Right. And if you compare us to other cities in the country, we're also we're really not at the top of the pack. There's one measure that's commonly used, which is number of staff per 10,000 residents. In New York City, the number's about 6. And that puts us, I believe, 49th out of the top 50 park systems in the country. So we have some work to recover that ground, but this is a great move in the right direction. And even in a city as big as New York, really over 170 million totaling all components, that's a lot of money. And going to the parks where it's going to have the biggest impact, where a renovation of $3 or $4 million can transform a park. We were at a location in Queens yesterday that's just blacktop. Right. It's amazing how many places that we call parks. We use that word park, and there's no grass, right, no green and maybe no trees. Right. And that's not what a park should be in New York City. And so this gives us the resources to bring those parks back to life, working really closely with the community that are going to have input in the design, and also a role long-term. There's money in this plan to seed Friends of groups, stewardship groups, provide them with small grants. Also, there's money through the Partnership for Parks that'll go for organizers and outreach workers. So we want communities to have a role in making their parks come alive. There's also crucially money in the plan for maintenance. It's not quite as sexy and exciting as building something from scratch, but it really matters over the long term to keep a park usable. So there's money in here, about $6 million for gardeners, maintenance workers, playground staff. Much of that came from the City Council, and it's important to make this plan really work long term.
Interesting. Now, you and Brad Lander have a bill that you proposed that would require another level of transparency for park budgeting in terms of reporting on an individual basis, park by park, how much is spent. Right. Why is this information important, and what would it allow you to do as a councilman, as chair of the Parks Committee, and just the department in general in terms of how they allocate spending? Right.
Well, it's not only true that parks like Central Park get a lot of private money, and that's done great things there, and parks in lower income neighborhoods don't. But we also don't know on a park-by-park basis how much the city is spending. And we don't know whether they're investing more in some neighborhoods than others. In a world where the squeaky wheel gets the grease, I think it's fair to ask whether neighborhoods where people are a little more politically empowered are able to get better, quicker, and faster service. But we don't have the tools to really assess that. Right. As a city council. And we are pushing for a change so that there'll be real transparency so that New Yorkers can see just how much is our park system spending on a park-by-park basis. Let's compare acre for acre how much we're spending in different locations. And there might be good rationale for variations in that based on how much a park is used or how difficult the terrain is. That's okay, but we don't even have information to begin to ask those questions. So that's what this bill is about that Councilmember Lander and I are pushing. We have a companion bill that would also ask for reporting in greater detail from the conservancies themselves so that we can look every time it's budget season on a park-by-park basis, and we can know how much is the city putting into that park, how much private money is going into that park, and New Yorkers can ask whether we have a fair distribution of resources.
And finally, I just wanted to finish up by asking you had proposed another bill also to lower the speed limit in parks in the wake of a tragic accident that happened. Talk to me a little bit about that and where that stands. Are you hopeful that there's a good prospect for that passing?
Well, look, anyone who's been in Central Park recently knows that usage is at an all-time high, and that particularly with people who are walking and jogging and bicycling, and you have also automobile traffic in the parks, that these have become incredibly crowded. I don't think there should be car traffic in the parks at all, period. I'm on record with that. In fact, yesterday, my colleague, Councilman Rosenthal, and I introduced a reso to that effect, actually an intro to that effect. But if there's going to be car traffic in the parks, let's at least slow them down and slow the bicycles down as well. 20 miles an hour is the speed that we're proposing, and that is really, if you're just a recreational bicyclist, that's probably faster than you would go in almost any condition. This is really only people who are racing and timing themselves and are probably competing competitively are going to be up against the upper limit here, and they should be traveling at a safer speed. There's so many people on these park paths that it's just not safe for people to be traveling at 30 miles an hour, and that's common. So we want to slow both automobile and bicycle traffic down. My goal again is to get cars out of the park to make it safer for everybody: pedestrians, joggers, bicyclists, everyone.
Councilman Mark Levine is the chair of the Council Parks Committee. Thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, Nate.